Okay. Just as a very quick review, as we're getting into the middle of 1943, the emphasis now has been on the shifting of success to the Allies from the Axis powers. And in the previous lectures, I've talked about different events that have occurred on the Eastern Front, North Africa, and in the Pacific, because in a way, the three different regions all operated very independently of each other. What I plan to do today is to continue a bit of the discussion in the Pacific up to a certain point, and then shift our narrative back primarily to the Eastern Front. During this particular set of time today, I will try to fill in any particular blanks that I either did not cover at all or that I want to reintroduce to provide a little different context. We have a whole series of maps laid out, which at break time, I would like you to look at. Over on that table is one of the Solomons area, which is being covered today. It'll give you a little perspective on the regions, their relationships to each other, and other things that are happening in the Pacific War. These up front are more detailed to the second portion of the lecture today on the Battle of Kursk and the aftermath. And the maps over here give you a little better idea of what's going on in Europe as a whole, as well as to a larger perspective on the Eastern Front. So please do that. There's also a book that I brought, which has the images of Kursk. A lot of pictures, not a lot of writing, but it does give you a visual impression of what was going on in the Eastern Front. To recap just quickly, you may remember that Guadalcanal started in August of 1942 and didn't conclude until February of 1943. In the last set of lectures, I talked about the New Guinea campaign, in which the Australian forces and American forces under MacArthur eventually took the northern portion of the island of New Guinea and set the stage for what was to be a culmination in taking the major Japanese port at Rabaul on New Britain Island. But in the lead up to that, New Britain kind of being the cap on the top of the Solomons. Just in terms of construct, the Solomon Islands are almost parallel, two sets of islands heading from the southeast to the northwest, with a capstone at New Britain, if you will, and the water in between was called the slot. You may have heard that term or remember that from obvious conversations. And Guadalcanal was in the southern line of islands down towards the far southeast. But now you had a very long distance to go if you wanted to take Rabaul. And that meant that there had to be this staging of various attacks that were going to lead up to having enough air power and naval power to overwhelm the Japanese defenses and allow landings on New Britain, at which point a Guadalcanal-like campaign would take place, culminating in capturing Rabaul. That never actually happened, at least in that particular way. There were landings on New Britain, but they never captured Rabaul. It basically learned to ignore it. In part of that stepstone, after Guadalcanal had fallen, there were a couple of small islands to the northwest of Guadalcanal, which were taken pretty much without any opposition at all from the Japanese. And American bases were set there in this stepping stone-like approach. And at this particular time, the Japanese were literally quite willing to abandon a lot of islands, but hold on to those they felt were most prominently important to retaining Rabaul and to holding the southern perimeter, which they wanted to defend against any Allied incursions that would threaten their control over the oil fields in Indonesia and the transports that had to carry the oil back to Japan, where it could be refined and used for their economy and for their military. They recognized, the Japanese recognized that they did not have sufficient forces to hold everything. That old military adage, he who defends everywhere defends nowhere, was very much in their minds. Remember that at this time, they're also very deeply committed in China. They've taken over Burma, which we talked about last time, in order to hold the rice fields and the grain which they needed to feed their people. And they had controlled Singapore and Indonesia, the Malay area, and so on. So they were stretched over thousands of miles, and they did not have resources sufficient to cover everywhere. So they left certain places completely abandoned. And it was obviously nice if that terrain could be useful for the Allies, particularly the United States, to take those places and build airfields, which would give them air supremacy, possibly, so they could move forward safely. The island hopping campaign that you hear so much about in the Pacific was not yet implemented, right? This was more a matter of taking places by opportunity, not because you had strategically planned to bypass certain areas. That comes a little bit later. And one of the reasons it comes a little bit later is this particular campaign that we're going to talk about, relatively brief as it is, a little bit more than 6 weeks or so, in New Georgia. And this advance up the Solomons, interestingly, also had a basic communication or command structure oddity. Technically, it was under MacArthur, but Halsey's fleet, which was completely necessary to make sure the transports could get there, that there was adequate support, Halsey actually had to get his support through Nimitz. So it's a really bizarre kind of command structure that occurred. Fortunately, it didn't inhibit either the Halsey's ability to respond to MacArthur's needs, nor did it inhibit Halsey's ability to get supplies and support from Nimitz. This shows you the Solomon Island chain, and in particular, just to emphasize, if I can do this without hitting the wrong button, down here is Guadalcanal. They've taken these particular islands pretty much at leisure, and now they're going to target New Georgia. You can see how this is not an island hopping situation. All right, they're just moving up the chain. Now, to emphasize a couple of points, here you have a very large island, and here you have another one. These were not occupied by the Japanese at all, interestingly. Again, he who defends everywhere defends nowhere. So in this particular circumstance, the Japanese had recognized that the critical elements for them were here, here, less so here, Bougainville to some extent, and then off the map up in here is where New Britain is. So in terms of the situation, the United States is going to just jump from this region to this region, doesn't have to worry about a flank attack here. And once they hold this, they'll have operational range for their aircraft to pretty much cover this whole area and allow them to move up the Solomon Island chain. This is called Operation Toenails. It's part of a larger operation called Operation Cartwheel, which was the grand campaign, as shown here, to eventually take Rabaul. Rabaul is here. This is New Britain. These are the Solomon Island chains. This is New Guinea. And you can see that it looks as though this is a no man's land for command, but MacArthur had much control over the ground forces that were going to be sent here, and Nimitz had control in the sense of the Navy. This is just a little bit of a blow up of it to show you a little bit more detail of where the various islands are in this particular setup. Now, prior to this time, Isoroku Yamamoto, who had been in a sense, commander-in-chief of the Japanese Imperial Navy, after the loss of Guadalcanal, was trying to figure out how best to defend this perimeter against the United States. And in doing so, he wanted to go visit various areas in order to see what they needed and get a hands-on or his own particular view, literally, of what was happening. This particular picture is the last photograph of him prior to his death, when his plane and its accompanying escorts were intercepted by the Americans, and his plane was shot down, and he was killed in the process. The desire to kill Yamamoto was made at the highest levels. Our intelligence services had learned of his particular itinerary, and the question came up, is it worth trying to kill him at the risk that we might reveal our intelligence, that we might reveal how we are reading Japanese codes or we're figuring out what's going on? Remember that prior to Midway, we had learned of the attack on Midway because we had been able to figure out parts of the Japanese code and understand that Midway was the primary target. This was a similar kind of thing, and it was felt that killing him was an important act to take, even at the risk of potentially losing that intelligence source. Now, I said on a set of previous lectures that Yamamoto made some fundamental strategic errors. And therefore, it begs the question then, was killing Yamamoto helpful to the Allied cause? We created a martyr of sorts by doing that. And similarly, who replaced him, and were they less capable than Yamamoto? I think that his death probably made little difference to how the Japanese fought the rest of the war. I don't think that, given the situations he had faced after Pearl Harbor, and then with the losses at Midway, Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal, that even someone as brilliant as he was going to change the outcome significantly. But emotionally, it had an effect on both sides, because for the United States, he was the bête noire, he was the monster, he was the brilliant opponent. It would be akin to having killed Rommel. Oh, gee, if we got rid of Rommel, just think of how the Germans might have collapsed, and so on. All right, so Operation Toenails is now different for the following reasons, and these are important ones because it helps create a little different level of understanding about what's happening in the Pacific theater, where many times the comments from historians and others has been, gee, if only the British and the Americans in the European theater had learned from the amphibious landings that took place in the Pacific, we could have avoided some of the tragedies like Omaha Beach or things of that sort. My counter argument is this. First, nowhere near the same number of soldiers were involved in an amphibious landing, or even over such enormous distances as were required when we were having the build up to Normandy. But secondly, it wasn't just the Marines who were carrying out amphibious landings in the Pacific. And indeed, a good part of it were American Army units. So the Marines weren't always first ashore. Now, when you look at the Central Pacific, with going to Tarawa and other places like that, yes, the Marines were it. But then if you realize how badly damaged they were on most of those landings, you might think maybe they might have learned something more by paying closer attention to what was going on elsewhere. In any case, the Americans that were going to be used were not the veterans from Guadalcanal. Those guys were tired out. Remember, Guadalcanal didn't terminate until February. So this is only a few months later. There's been an operation to take some other islands that were unoccupied, but that consumes energy and men. And now you're bringing in more units to the Pacific, and they're green. They've never faced combat before. And this will have great significance when we get to the last part of this section. The forces were split up into different components, and they were going to land at different spots along the New Georgia coast. But what you'll see is the New Georgia Islands actually are several. Here's Rendova, for example, which will have some importance. Why New Georgia? This right here, Munda, an airfield. While much of New Georgia is mountainous, the coastline areas gave plenty of room to develop airfields. And the Japanese had used this airfield as a staging place in order to attack Guadalcanal. So the Americans wanted to take over this airfield and give them the power, the air power, to cover regions to the north. The landings went off basically without much resistance. That is, the initial landings found places where there were very few Japanese. And as a result, you'll note, I'm sorry, let me go back. Ooh, wrong way. Almost there. We'll come to that guy in a little bit. Landings were made on some of these small islands in order to establish artillery positions. Notice the scale of miles, so that if you're only a few miles offshore, you can put artillery fire down on these areas. The landings here were critical insofar as it excluded any Japanese control down in this region, but more importantly, gave you some ports where you could put transports and staging equipment, bring in supplies and things of that sort. The other important element about this is there were practically no roads. In other words, if you landed somewhere, you were basically stuck going overland through bush to get anywhere. There were a few tracks, but they were very rudimentary and certainly not very capable of handling vehicular transport. So you needed places where you could stockpile supplies out of danger from the Japanese who were concentrated in this region. This is called the Dragon Peninsula, all up through here. And then you could transport through smaller vessels and supply your troops in these regions, which are going to support the main attacks, which are eventually going to involve landings in this region, and as you see this arrow up here at Rice Harbor. The complexity of this is considerable. The considerations for terrain, the issues related to reefs and the rest of it all of which are important to the proper conduct. In this particular situation, the other part to emphasize is that, again, you're dealing with a raider battalion here to come in. In other words, very small units that are being landed to raid and establish a bridgehead through which you can funnel supplies, and eventually, trying to avoid most of these mountains, bring your main troops down towards Munda, which is down off screen at this lower left. Here you begin to see that there is a swampy area here, and the Americans found themselves struggling against some Japanese resistance, which in terms of numbers was relatively modest. But at the same time, enough was a resistance that it slowed down the American attacks. Now, let me just scroll forward here for a minute. The Japanese still wanted to protect Munda. They wanted to bring in, as they had done on Guadalcanal, destroyers, which would carry supplies and reinforcements, bring them down, because their intent was to stall as much as possible any American advances. Because of the narrow confines, due to all of these number of islands and the various channels and the uncertainty of where there was an appropriate depth of water for ships to come through, it was necessary to have shallow draft patrol vessels which could serve to detect incoming ships by detecting them, either if they were armed properly to attack, or more importantly, to send the information back to headquarters where the appropriate forces, either naval or air or both, could be mustered in order to intercept and deflect the Japanese landings. This particular gentleman, known to pretty much all of us, initially had been rated 4F. He was not to be in the armed services at all. Now, there are different interpretations of why he got his father to get him entry. His brother had been in the Air Force, if I remember, and eventually was killed over in a bomber in England. Part of the insinuation was that this was done because if he was to have a political future, he had to have been in combat. Take that for what it's worth. Interestingly, though, he almost got himself thrown out because he had an affair with a Danish journalist who had connections to Hitler. If that reminds you of any current politician or ex-politician whose last name begins with K and Fang Fang, I think, or whatever. You can draw on that as you will. Anyway, he eventually was sent to Chicago. Remember that on Lake Michigan, there was much naval training going on. And there he joined the Mortar Torpedoes Boat Squadron Training Center, and then he was sent to the Pacific and eventually given command of this PT-109. These patrol boats had torpedoes attached to them, and at this time they were fast craft. They were relatively lightly armed, except for the torpedoes, but it was thought against the appropriate target they should be effective. As it turns out, the PT boats generally didn't do a great deal of damage to the Japanese. But they were out there, they were out surveying, they were out to find the opposing fleets or ships as they could. During a particular night, PT-109 was doing its job and was struck by the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, which basically cut the boat in half. 2 people were killed immediately, and the others just hung on to the bow, which was kind of floating in this region for a period of time until eventually they were able to swim to this island, Plum Pudding, here. Over the next couple of days, one thing that Kennedy did was he and another of his crewmen swam literally for hours to try to get to other islands where they might be able to establish a connection to either coast watchers or get access to a radio or get food and supply. One of his crewmen was badly injured in this, and Kennedy had helped get him to shore safely. So at this particular point, they finally were able to get to Oleana Island, Olsana Island here, where he did run into some coast watchers, and eventually they were rescued on August 8th. So they had been sunk almost the week before, and they were able to be rescued ultimately. Now, there was a naval battle that took place a couple of months later. Prior to that, there had been a series of engagements between Japanese reinforcements that were attempting to come down and re-support either the Japanese at Munda, which was on the main island of New Georgia, or on an ancillary island, Kolombangara, I believe it's called, and Vella La Vella. During the course of this, and I'm going to show you a picture in a little bit, one of the engagements was actually very successful for the Americans. Out of 4 Japanese destroyers that were encountered by American ships, 3 of them were sunk, and one, the Shigure, was survived, but had been hit by a torpedo, which unfortunately turned out to be a dud. And this was an enormous improvement in American night fighting and the capabilities of our torpedoes, which up until then had largely been disastrous. A second operation occurred later, which I'm going to, I think there may be a lack of sequence here, but let me back up 1 second and make sure. Yeah, all right. As the fighting on around Munda gradually concluded, which happened in early August, right, when basically on the New Georgia Island, not Kolombangara nor Vella La Vella, but Munda has fallen to the United States. The American troops who had been engaged in that had suffered enormously. And I'm going to read this quick paragraph to you because it highlights something, again, we tend to forget about what it means to take Americans who have not had any experience with combat and put them into situations like this where you're in combat, almost literally on the front line for 6 weeks without relief, without much rotation. And here was a report by one of the medical officers. At least 50% of these individuals requiring medical attention or entering medical installations were the picture of utter exhaustion. Face expressionless, knees sagging, body bent forward, arms slightly flexed and hanging loosely, hands with palms slightly cupped, marked coarse tremor of fingers, feet dragging, and an overall appearance of apathy and physical exhaustion. About 20% of the total group were highly excited, crying, wringing their hands, mumbling incoherently, an expression of utter fright or fear, trembling all over, startled at the least sound or unusual commotion, having the appearance of trying to escape impending disaster. Another 15% showed manifestations of various types of true psychoneurotic complexes. The remaining 15% included the anxiety states and those with various bizarre somatic disturbances. These were the individuals whose symptoms were of insidious onset, starting with insomnia, vague digestive symptoms, bad dreams, frequency of urination, irritability, diminished ability to concentrate, and a generally reduced efficiency in the performance of the assigned duties. So the importance of this is just what we call combat fatigue, or this isn't really quite PTSD because that usually has a hiatus after the initial bits of combat. But the constant physical stress that they were under was such that it engendered an understanding in the military, going up to the higher ranks, that leaving men in combat for weeks on end was truly debilitating. It would take an enormous amount of effort to recover these individuals, even to get them back to a reasonable semblance of life when they were home, much less get them back, because they've experienced combat, into the front lines as veterans. This kind of effect was so pronounced and so important that rotation of getting people out of the front lines and getting them back to places of rest was important. If, for example, you watch a series called The Pacific on, I think it's either Amazon or Netflix, some of this really comes through. And some of you may know about an author named Robert Leckie, I believe, who wrote about his experience on Guadalcanal. And I think it's called A Helmet for My Pillow. It's a fascinating read, but in the show, the movie, Leckie suffers combat fatigue. He's basically pulled out because of the stress and what was happening to him personally. And it's so much more real than just reading something here. Oh, I must have hit a button there. I'm sorry. I hope you weren't paying any attention to that at all. Oh, boy. I'll show you this because this picture highlights it. This is a real guy, Kursk. And this picture was taken of him, and it exemplifies exactly what I've been talking about. 1,500 cases in one division in the months fighting on New Georgia. So it wasn't so much getting shot or blown up or whatever, as it was even if you came through without a scratch. The destructiveness was enormous. Now, as operations concluded, one of the things that happened, and I'm going to go back for a minute. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way again. Get very challenged. Here we go, the Selfridge. Right. This particular battle took place a couple months later, but the reason I highlight it is this. Look at the results. What this taught the Americans was that even as late as 1943, in the latter part of 1943, the Japanese were hardly a foe to be ignored. They still had enormous capability and talent, even if they were on the defensive. 6 destroyers against 9. They lose 1 destroyer, we lose 1 sunk, 2 heavily damaged. Now, they lost more killed and captured because of the barges. But the importance here is that for the US Navy, this was never an idea that you could beat up your opponent and get away unscathed. And this particular picture shows you one ship that was involved in this Battle of Vella Lavella. And you can see the enormous amount of damage that it has taken. Here's a guy sitting in this destroyed turret. But notice that this is one of the other key elements that helped the United States win this war. She was damaged, she was repaired, and she actually served through the rest of the war. In other words, the infrastructure that we had created in the United States was such that we could take a ship as badly beaten up as that, and rather than scrap it, we could repair it and send it back into combat. And we could do it more quickly than if you had to build a new one. Once the Munda had been taken, which is down in this section here, once this had been completely taken, the Japanese felt that it was necessary to evacuate. And as they did at Guadalcanal, despite what seems to be a preponderance of American air and naval power, they were remarkably successful at extracting their soldiers. The United States moved on to take this island, Arundel, just off the coast. Columbangara is up here, as you'll see, and Vella La Vella is further north. But again, we're using this incremental approach. We're not bypassing anything. We're driving them out, pushing them back, forcing their evacuations. It's not until we begin to appreciate that we can ignore some of them and eventually conclude this campaign. I showed this because I want the numbers to stand out. About 43,000 were involved. We lost 1,200. The Japanese lost 1,700 dead, but they had this many wounded. Look at the number of aircraft they lost compared to ours, but look at the relative strength. So they lost 40% of the strength there, as opposed to ours. And this doesn't include the wounded and the battle casualties that I showed you earlier. But we realized that the Japanese, as we had learned partially on Guadalcanal, but less so at New Guinea, was that the Japanese tended to stay in place and die rather than give up. And this is one of those issues that, as we recognize the ultimate costs that the conflict was going to bring to our doorstep, we needed to find a different strategy, a different maneuver, which would take us beyond having to fight every step of the way. And this particular approach we now learned as island hopping. This just shows you again, in a sense, what the island hopping would consist of, because while we would take a section here in order to control this airfield, and we would do the same at Torquena up here on the northern end of Bougainville, we would bypass a lot of stuff here. The Shortlands had a decent port, and we were going to ignore that. And we were only going to take what could be given to us easily. We were not going to try to fight any major campaign. And that even existed once we had gotten onto New Britain itself. And although it looks like we fought our way all the way across to the neck, the Japanese had already realized the impossibility of holding this part of New Britain. So they had withdrawn up to this narrow neck where there was little opportunity for maneuver. And rather than bother trying to get through here and take Rabaul, we just said, leave them there. Because if we control the air and naval or the sea areas around here, these guys can do nothing. They'll be lucky if they even have enough food to survive. This same principle had been tried somewhat when MacArthur was taking the northern parts of New Guinea by jumping from spot to spot and ignoring anything in between for the same reason. But again, the strategy hadn't really struck home until we had fought our way up the Solomons, found ourselves dealing with New Britain and saying, we got a long way to go before we get to Japan. Now, I'm going to stop for a minute here because the next section is fairly long. I'd like you to be able to take a break, but if you have any questions about this particular time frame or these particular events that I've just discussed, feel free to ask, but stretch your legs a little bit, and we'll reconvene in just a couple of minutes.
For the folks at home, before the class, you distributed a file of maps. Are those the maps that you're displaying in these lectures?
Not all
So
of
that
them.
the people at home could refer back to those.
Right, but not all of them. I mean, some of the detailed maps I've completely not bothered with because you don't need that unless you really want to delve into the campaign.
Right.
But in terms of the overall perspective, yes. Okay. All right. Take a few minutes if you'd like. Let's reconvene in 10 minutes. Tom, do you want to stop recording now and then start it again when we do it? Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. This next section deals with the Eastern Front, as you can tell from things that I've scattered around the room. And in particular, this battle, Kursk, as I've written as my interpretation, the last major German offensive. There were other German offensives, of course, the Ardennes being one that we're very familiar with, and the fighting in Hungary in early 45. But this really has achieved a prominence and importance in the Eastern Front. And sometimes a portion of this has been called the greatest tank battle that ever occurred. There again are some adjustments in how many tanks were involved and how many losses occurred and so on. And what really matters, though, is why this occurred and what was its significance. So that's what we're going to talk about now. This particular reprise of what happened after Stalingrad sets up the situation that we're going to discuss in some detail come July 43. After the encirclement of Stalingrad, which you can see here, the Sixth Army and associated units were cut off, and there were practically, I'll use the word, no survivors, in the sense that of all of those who were killed and wounded or captured, very few ever got home again. And secondary attacks that took place here and here destroyed the Italian and Romanian armies and severely damaged the Hungarian armies and forced the front line back to the area of Rostov. And then further attacks even drove the Germans back further. The German troops that were down in the Caucasus trying to get to the oil fields at Maykop and eventually Baku were nearly cut off when the Russians approached Rostov. And this army group down here called Army Group A got a number of its units out barely in order to help stem the ongoing attacks here, but a number were left on what's called the Kuban Peninsula as it links up to Crimea. There's a straits here between the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, and this area was held in part to keep Crimea under German control. The concern Hitler had was that if the Russians took Crimea, they would be able to place airfields here which could bomb the Iranian oil fields at Ploesti, which they had actually done earlier in the war, and was one of the reasons why Hitler emphasized the importance of Crimea. The Russians took Kharkov temporarily, and then General Manstein, who was put in charge of this area of the German forces, launched an offensive which severely damaged the Russians and forced them back out of Kharkov and created this bulge that you see here, centered around this city of Kursk. Up in the north, there had been some other operations which took place, which I discussed at some length in previous lectures, but the importance was up here. The Germans withdrew troops from salients in order to straighten the line out and allow reinforcements to be brought down and eventually stem the tide here and hold the Russians off. Now, with the front line established, as you'll see here, their ultimate question as you get into the middle of 1943 is, what now? So let's look at it from both sides' perspectives. If you're Hitler, the question in front of you is, what do we do? Do we stand on the strategic defensive? Do we withdraw from Orel and shorten this line further so that all the troops that are concentrated here can be brought back? We can develop a defensive line here and have a strategic reserve. Do we allow Kharkov to remain in our hands for prestige, or do we give it up in order to straighten this line? So again, we can have some strategic reserves here, but that also means that we're going to shift the initiative from Germany to the Soviet Union. I'm going to use the word Russia as synonymous with the Soviet Union. And if we do that, where are they likely to strike? And how do we prepare ourselves to meet that? And what's the ultimate endpoint? In other words, if we withdraw and straighten our line and go on the strategic defensive, how is this war supposed to end? Ultimately, you have to answer that question in order to determine what's going to happen next. Now, the other ramifications of it are these. Romania, Hungary, and Italy lost large numbers of soldiers. Italy, basically, after this particular collapse, withdraws nearly all of its forces from the Eastern Front. Why? Well, in part because they've just lost all of North Africa.
You're not hearing anything. Turn up volume.
Oh, I'm sorry. They're having trouble hearing us? Someone just spoke, so. Okay. You people out in Zoom land can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, so if you're going to turn that initiative around to allow the Soviets to pick the time and place for an attack, what does that mean? You've got Romania that you have lost a lot of people, but you want to protect Romania. You've had the Hungarians lost, the Italians have left. So what do you have left? What can you accomplish? The alternative from the standpoint of Hitler is, suppose we attack here, and we establish a pocket with the Russians caught in that pocket and we destroy them. If we do that, then we will have weakened the Russians further, and Russia still will not have the initiative. Even though this will be costly, by the time it's accomplished, we'll have destroyed many more Russians as we have in the previous 2 years, from 41 to 42, and perhaps limited their ability to conduct any further hurt against us. Now, beyond this particular point, the only other thing Hitler was hoping to be able to do was have Army Group North, which was up here, eventually cut off Leningrad entirely. There had been a small land route opened right along Lake Ladoga, along the southern portion, into Leningrad. So Leningrad was still under siege, but it wasn't completely cut off from all supply. So if we're successful here, we can send troops up and support Army Group North. We can drive up to Lake Ladoga again. We completely isolate Leningrad, and eventually maybe that will fall because it's already been under siege for a long time. Pipe dream, maybe. It's already known to the German high command that they cannot replace their losses.
Yeah.
So that in itself is a problem. Their appreciation of the Russian situation was still that they didn't understand the amount of support Russia could generate from within its own population to bring literally hundreds of thousands of people into the military to fight. This difference in appreciation meant that it was unknown to the Germans precisely what they were facing in terms of numbers and equipment. And by this time, the Russians, who had moved over 1,500 military factories to the Urals, were now up and running full steam. Yes.
It would seem the Germans have the proverbial tiger by the tail.
Yes.
They can't let go. And then they can't retreat, they're stuck.
Right.
And they're.
Indeed. And so think of it in terms of what would you do at this point? Can you get a negotiated settlement with Russia? If so, what are you going to give the Russians? What are you going to get in return? And at the very beginning of July, an event takes place where the British and the Americans invade Sicily. So now you're Hitler and you're thinking, uh-oh, southern flank is just opened up a little bit. What am I going to do about that? Is negotiation on the table? Well, except that at the Casablanca conference, Roosevelt came out afterward and said unconditional surrender. What does that leave you with? What are you fighting for at this point? You're facing unconditional surrender. Well, we went through that in a way with the Treaty of Versailles. Are we about to let the Allies again dismember Germany further and pay indemnities of who knows how much while our armies are still intact and fighting? That's the deeper question that has to be answered at the highest political and military levels. Now, what about the Russians? The Russians have taken millions of casualties by this time, but they're still growing in strength. The Red Air Force has been resurgent. The production lines are wide open. Supplies are getting in from the west through Murmansk and Archangel, and from the south through Iran up into the Caucasus region. You have been successful in devastating German troops in a variety of offensive, even going back to December of 41 into January and February of 42, and then Stalingrad and so on. You know that you've pressed the Germans back on their heels. So what is your plan? It appears pretty obvious that Moscow is no longer in danger. Leningrad is still in danger, but that should be manageable. You've got a supply line open, you've got resources, you should be able to keep the Germans from cutting it off entirely. So where else do you have an advantage? Well, down here, there isn't much of one. And in fact, by having the German troops stuck here, that's actually bad for the Germans, better for the Russians. You don't have to destroy them, you just want to keep them there. So what about this region? Well, here's this big salient. What can we do there? This change in strategic thinking is one of the highlights of Russian operational and strategic art. It shows how much they learned and how quickly they were able to adjust to changing circumstances despite the pummeling they had taken. What do I mean by that? The Russians decided that they would wait for an attack. They'd let the Germans attack them first. They were pretty sure about where the Germans were going to attack. This was a bulge that would be hard to ignore. So what did they do? They built a whole series of defensive works in depth with minefields, with all kinds of obstacles to any armored advance. Remember, armored advances had always been rapid, had always gone through weak areas and cut off troops and allowed them to get killed in these cauldrons. They worked diligently using thousands upon thousands of laborers to build trenches and fortifications, anti-tank ditches, and the rest of it. And they mustered an enormous amount of combat power in this region. The plan was this: let the Germans attack them from whatever direction they were coming, most likely on the flanks, and let them weaken themselves to such an extent that the reserves, which were concentrated here, here, and here, were going to be able to blast through the weakened Germans, and in fact might be able to cut them off here, trapping them as they had here at Stalingrad, and possibly, although this is a long distance to go, they might be able to drive south and cut off the Crimea, and that would trap all of these German units here. They'd have no way to get out. It took an enormous amount of courage and planning to be able to do that. And as a result, both sides decided that they would muster an enormous amount of combat power in this region. It's interesting also that just prior to the launching of this attack called Operation Citadel by the Germans, Hitler made an interesting comment. He said, basically, my stomach turns over every time I think about it. Historians will say that as happened in 1941, when the Germans delayed their attack to June 22nd because they had to deal with the Balkans and Yugoslavia in May and deal with Greece, that delay led to the failure of Operation Barbarossa to drive all the way to Moscow. I don't know that that's particularly true. There was a delay here as well on the part of the Germans launching the attack because Hitler wanted to get the new Panther tank on the lines, and he had some other enormous vehicles that they wanted to try out. But the Panther was to be the counterstroke to the T-34. Because up until then, the best German tank, the Mark IV with an upgunned 75 millimeter, 76.3 millimeter, I forget, was the only tank capable of taking on the Tiger, taking on the T-34. And he wanted the Panther, which was a whole step up ahead of it. So what was mustered? Just look at these numbers. Germany, 2,700 tanks, 900,000 infantry. Russians, over 3,000, 1.3 million, and so on. Now, think about those numbers and think about what is going to take place in just a matter of 1 week. All right. This is really pretty extraordinary. As I talked about, here was the plan in more detail. Army Group Center was to be in control of the northern attack. The 9th Army was under Model, who had gained a reputation as an enormously competent defensive specialist, but he was to conduct an offense. They were to drive to Kursk. Down here, Army Group South was under Manstein, with Hoth and Kemp controlling most of the armored forces that were to go here. The other part that we tend to forget is that there still were a lot of horse-drawn vehicles here. This was, when we talk about armor units and we look at pictures of the American units and we think about the Gulf War and everything is mechanized, there are a lot of people still walking. There are a lot of horses still pulling carts, towing artillery pieces and so on. But the intent was to reach Kursk together, which was a nice sort of Gettysburg-like road intersection, and cut off all these various Russian armies by holding this against the Russian reserves, which would necessarily try to attack and break in. They would all be destroyed. This line would be sealed. It was obvious, putting this all together to both sides, that preparations were being made. And I show this slide only to indicate the enormous number of units. And these are dealing just with armies. And when you start breaking down, understanding what's happening, you have to get all the way down to the platoon and squad levels with orders and plans of how to break in and do what you're going to do here. And that's what I mean in terms of the Russian improvement in operational arts. They had learned from painful lessons all the things they needed to learn in order to handle this onslaught from the Germans. And as you can see from the limitations here and here, when the attacks did occur, they occurred and penetrated not very far. A few miles. This again is just another way of showing the total concentrations. And I show this again, not because you have to remember it, but because the mustering of forces here in the middle of the war is enormous. And when you put into context the enormous number of casualties that both sides have taken, much worse on the Soviet side than on the German side. But it gives you an example of exactly what it means to have total war, something I've alluded to before. Everybody is involved. And civilians built many of the field fortifications that were being used. The other part that I want to emphasize here are the ratios that you see. Despite the victory that occurs to the Soviets in this, it's not as though they had an enormous preponderance of power, at least in terms of the ratio of numbers. So again, this allows us to understand how much more capable the Soviets became over the course of 2 years of intensive training, as we'll call it. Now the attacks get underway, and when they occur, interestingly, the Russians learned of the precise timing of the attacks through deserters and through their own intelligence services. When they learned this, they planned a counter bombardment to develop shortly before the Germans were actually to start their offensive. The idea was that by using heavy artillery barrages, you could disrupt the assembly areas for the troops that were going to conduct the initial attacks against the defensive lines. This shows you some of the defensive lines that were being prepared. And again, I show this because as a German, you knew this. You were having planes fly over here and do reconnaissance. You were finding out where the strong points were. You were trying to to uncover whatever the Russians were trying to hide from you. And the Russians were very adept at camouflage and things of that sort. But certain things you just can't hide, like trenches and anti-tank ditches and things of that nature. So they knew they were facing this, and yet they somehow felt they were capable of gaining access into the deep interior. Two of the most prominent people involved here, Marshal Zhukov, whom you've heard about before here, and Konev, who became especially important later on in the war, sitting down and figuring out the plans as to how they're going to disrupt and manage the German attack. Now, as we're looking here, we're starting out as the, again, exquisite detail to show you the complexity of the defensive lines that are set up. The earlier slide showed you more of the big defensive belts that were established with intervals in between where there was only rudimentary fieldworks. But at the front line, you developed a whole different layering of trenches, and you allocated your particular units in such a way to give support to your neighbor and force the Germans to breach a whole different set of lines, have to overcome these defenses as you go. This was going to be a very costly affair, and it was going to cost heavily among infantry in particular. As we say in this one here, the map shows divisional belts for the 52 Guards Rifle Division, about 8,000 men. Across here, if you look at this timeline, you realize this is a very short distance that we're talking about. And basically, these guys on the Soviet side are told to stand where you are, take whatever losses you're going to take, slow the Germans down, don't plan to retreat. Now, if you're an individual soldier and that's your order, you're thinking, no way out for me. I'll fight as long as I can, but when I'm dead, I'm dead. There's no more future for me. I'm going to stay there. Of course, if you try to retreat, the NKVD is back there waiting for you, and you're going to be executed on the spot. So there was both the carrot and stick that you're facing. This gives you an idea of some of the terrain. It's actually more broken up than it appears on most maps. But the important part and the reason for showing this particular slide is this. You see here you have armored units, right? You can tell that that's a tank and that's a tank. It's hard to tell just what kind they are. But if you're an anti-tank gunner and you're 1,000 yards away, depending upon the weapon you have, you might be able to hit that and blow it up. So the idea behind this slide is to show you an element of dispersal. These are not hub-to-hub cavalry charges that you see depicted in Napoleonic Wars and things of that sort. But it's also to show you the broad view that you have. And if you're hunkered down in a camouflaged area and they can't see you, you can pick them off. So this is a very difficult thing. You don't just send a lot of armor in and think, oh gosh, we're going to overrun everybody in front of us. Now, I made an allusion to this earlier, and that is the resurrection of the Red Air Force. This particular airplane, the Sturmovik, was actually armored to protect the pilots, and it was equipped with weaponry that would allow it to attack ground units and attack tanks and other armored vehicles from above, because the armor that was on the decks was much thinner than the armor on the side or particularly near the front. And the Russians brought enough aircraft into this fray that they were able to severely contest air control with the Germans, something that they had not been able to do up until this time. This gives you another picture of German armor on the move. And the reason for these skirts that you see here is that anti-armor ammunition had a particular ability to penetrate armor, depending upon the angle at which it struck, and so on. These skirts actually disrupted the explosion of the ammunition as it struck the vehicle and prevented it from penetrating deeper into the vehicle and killing the occupants. And it also shows the concentration and the smoke and dust clouds and the broken up terrain that you see, as opposed to that flat one that I showed you before. The initial penetration in the South under Manstein made progress and broke through a number of different lines, but there was enough resistance on the flanks to stall any further initiative to drive completely north. And as a result, Manstein made a shift in the direction of attack from going up north to more towards the northeast. And as he moved in this direction, the Russian High Command freed up what was called the steppe front. It was in the reserve, with a very heavy tank concentration, 5th Tank Army in particular. And they were mustered to come and meet the advancing Germans head on. Now, this is a more recent description of the number of tanks and armored vehicles that were involved. In other histories, the numbers are easily triple this, but David Glantz and others have done a very careful analysis of both German and Russian archives and come to the conclusion that the numbers involved were not as great. In addition, the losses sustained in this particular fighting were not as heavy as many of the older histories will describe, but they were not insignificant. And when you consider that this was a battle that took place over only 2 days, it has a more concrete feeling related to it. So here, for example, total losses for the Germans on this side, 43 to 80 tanks, whereas the Soviets lost 340. They had about 3,500 killed, wounded, missing, compared to 800 here. But that's just in a couple days and only on one section of this front. Some of the photographs that depict some of the fighting that went on. The Mickey Mouse ears you see over here is a Russian tank. You guys will recognize that monster vehicle. This is the number T-34 over here. And this again shows some of the destructiveness that occurs with vehicles burnt out and dead, piled up on the battlefield. I show this because this swirling effect that you see here indicates the importance of senior commanders. You'll often see, and even Eisenhower basically said this at Normandy, once you start the plan rolling, it really depends on others to control it. That basically he becomes almost passive. It's almost like a head coach in a football game where other people have to control what's going on. And you have only a marginal ability to interfere with it. But these swirling lines show all the movements that were occurring and the major conflicts that were occurring around this particular site in the battlefield. and shows you the only way these things happened was when people were giving orders and seemed to understand what needed to be done. So a level of coherency and training that's enormous. And again, a tribute to the Soviet experience and learning. The attacks themselves often carried out with infantry walking behind armor. Why would you do this when what we think are the armor sweeping forward and getting into the rear areas and disrupting everything? And that's because armor without infantry protection was very vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. And you needed infantry to help clear the way. The experience of being in combat, even if it's just for several days as opposed to weeks, as we saw in New Georgia, it can be etched in the faces of every person involved. Doesn't look happy. On the northern flank, Model made even less progress. Only a couple miles, and it was very clear early on that he was being stalled. Once that happened, once it stalled, very quickly, as I'd outlined, where the Soviets were able to implement their strategic plan beautifully. They did exactly what they planned. They stopped the German offensives. They caused a large number of German casualties, destruction of armor, destruction of aircraft, and so on, and then stepped off into the offensive with two major attacks, one to the north of the salient and one to the south. And the Germans at this point had very little they could do. This is just a summary of when Hitler calls an end to Operation Citadel. He calls it off, and almost immediately the Russians counterattack. This is now early July, all right? The Allies are in Sicily. Keep that in mind. And the Italians are back home trying to protect their homeland. They have mustered an enormous number of guns, tanks, and men. And the casualties, while proportionally don't seem to be disfavoring the Germans, yet the production capabilities within the Soviet Union compared to the production capabilities within Germany, as well as the inability of Germany to find replacements. You begin to see these enormous numbers tallying up. Look at the 600,000, total 863, killed, wounded, sick, aircraft, tanks. Look at this number, 6,000. They replace them. Germany doesn't.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the Germans were depending on operational talent, I think you call it.
Mhm.
I think that's a euphemism for a pipe train. I mean, you gotta wonder what were they thinking?
Well, it goes back to the issue that I wanted to address right at the beginning as well. If you're Hitler or the German high command and you're faced with this bulge at Kursk, what do you do next? Admittedly, you could say, well, gee, if they stayed on the defensive, because they've demonstrated that when the Russians attack and they break through and they are driving into the German rear, the Germans are able to counterattack and cut off those troops and destroy them when they're outside their fortifications. Is that a better place to go? And then once you have done that, even if it meant you had to give up territory, what's next? In other words, is there any way to win this war? Remember, Japan faced the same thing, and I use this example at the end of my lecture on Guadalcanal, that understandably can be contested as to a change or a turning point in the Pacific War. But it was after Guadalcanal that the Japanese said, we're not going to defeat the United States. So where do we go from here? We haven't lost either. We're on that cusp. Where do we go from here? You can't negotiate a settlement at this point. It's gone too far.
I don't think Stalin would have been in the mood to negotiate with Hitler after what Hitler had done to him.
Right.
I mean, even, you know,
The only way the only way Stalin would have agreed to anything was to say, I'm taking everything up to the German border and you're going to demilitarize. And if you're Hitler, you're going to say, okay, I'm all right with that. No, because the next step is the Russians are in Berlin again. Only this time they didn't have to fight for it. Right? And if you're Britain and the United States and you've got an agreement with Russia that you're not going to set a separate peace, even though it's a scrap of paper, to use the phrase from World War I, would you fight over a scrap of paper? You have this same dynamic at place. It's important because when you step into a conflict, and I'm going to mention a couple of spots in our own history where we've gotten involved in some conflicts, and it appears in retrospect, but even at the time looking forward, that the end point was never clear. So let's take, I'm not going to use Vietnam because there's a different element involved there, but let's take Korea. And then let's take Iraq and Afghanistan. What were we trying to accomplish? What was our end game when we committed armed forces into those conflicts? And that's the kind of situation that you're dealing with here, because now Germany has initiated this conflict with particular goals in mind, and now they're no longer feasible. As you said, you got a tiger by the tail. What do you do now? Okay. But the Russians are not done. The attacks on the north, and this is Modell's 9th Army down here, pushing into the Kursk salient, but now the attacks are coming on his north, and he better get out of Dodge in a hurry, or these guys are all going to be lost. And the Russians make very rapid penetrations, so that here's 4th of July. The attacks conclude down here around the 7th of July, and within a relatively short period of time, they have driven forward so that by the 1st of August, this area is almost set to be cut off and surrounded. Well, they've experienced that at Stalingrad. Time to get out of Dodge this time around. Orel finally falls to the Soviets, and this is a big morale boost for them. This is a painting of some of the destruction that takes place during Operation Citadel. It's a little out of sequence. I apologize for that. But it gives you an idea of the intensity of the fighting. This wasn't always at long range. There was literally some nearly hand-to-hand combat. Now, in the southern portion, after Manstein, who initially resisted Hitler's demand that the offensive be stopped, is now forced, partly because Hitler just says, no, you're not going to attack anymore. You got to start pulling back. The Russians very quickly began an offensive, and within a short period of time, they push the Germans back, and Kharkov falls for the last time to the Soviets. There's not a lot that the Germans have left to be able to stop the Russian onslaught. This broader map that covers the entire Eastern Front, Leningrad's up here, Black Sea, Crimea, you can see that the amount of territory that the Russians, the Soviets take as a result of the collapse of this particular salient is huge. And importantly, they're driving along the northern border of the Sea of Azov to the Black Sea. Odessa's here. The Perekop Isthmus is here, and that is the narrow neck that leads to the Crimea. And here, the Kuban, the Germans finally realized there's no point in hanging on, especially when the Russians look like they might get to cut off Crimea altogether. So they're withdrawn back onto the Crimean Peninsula. As the Soviets uncover much of this territory that had been occupied for a substantial time by the Germans, they also, again, encountered enormous evidence of various atrocities carried out against the civilian population. So this was not a good time for the German forces. This just shows the collapse of the Kuban. They'd been there for a while, the Germans. They had built defensive lines, but they knew they couldn't withstand any major Soviet attack. So not only was the threat to the north a problem, but the Soviets had mustered sufficient force to push the Germans back. They weren't able to cut them off. The Germans were able to escape. But again, it was a close run thing. Further north, remember I had said that if Citadel was successful, there was a plan to attack around Leningrad and cut Leningrad off again completely from support. However, the Soviets had decided that they were likely to be successful where they were, and therefore they were going to challenge Army Group North, which was holding all of this area, by attacking. And if they were successful, they might be able to get up to the Baltic using Lake Peipus here and other spots to protect the flank, because there's no way for anybody to cross this region. And when you're back up here, you've got only a narrow neck to seal, and the Germans all in this area are going to be caught. So they were planning, again, a massive set of advances after the Kursk attacks. This gives us a bigger detail of what was going on and shows this open line that existed to Leningrad through this particular corridor. They were designed to push this all the way back and completely free it. Further south, the attack faltered. They weren't as successful as they'd like. They were able to get through a distance. But this is really nothing more than about 50 miles by 50 miles in area. And were never able to seriously threaten Army Group North at this time. But again, think of the time frame in which we're looking too. The offensive in Citadel started in July, and this is a number of months later that they're working to penetrate. In other words, combat never stopped anywhere along the Eastern Front. You might shift from one area to another, but there's always fighting going on. And the casualties are happening, deepening every single day. Further south, this just shows how the penetration of the initial Russian onslaught breached this particular defensive line along the Meuse River. Here's Rostov over here. They've driven the Germans back, and now they're getting up close to the Dnieper River. And the interesting part in terrain is that the western edge of the Dnieper is higher than the eastern side. So the advantage to the defender is that the attacker has to cross a river and he has to attack high ground. But because of the imbalance that was occurring in German forces at this time, the Russians were pushing ahead as fast as they could because they wanted to get troops across the Dnieper and prevent this from being a strong defensive line. As they made more progress, they were able to cross the river in a number of locations. And although some of those bridgeheads were beaten back, the Russian high command showed enough flexibility and enough talent to shift forces to other sectors which were under less threat and make their bridgehead much more secure. And once you had a good-sized bridgehead, it could no longer be collapsed by the German forces. You now had them threatened with having no substantial line of defense. Now they could start building a line, but this was something they had to do on the fly. So this looks like a well-developed line, but it actually isn't. It's just that where they thought they could establish something. And subsequent attacks are going to take them all the way across so that the entry to the Crimea is now sealed off. And not too much more to go here. This again, just as a demonstration of the enormous amount of activity that's taking place along the Dnieper River, how the the Soviets are trying to breach this line and disrupt any advantage that it would otherwise offer. And again, it shows that the Germans were not entirely bereft of competency. Here they launch a counterattack against several of the Russian units that had penetrated the Dnieper line, and they crushed them in this particular situation. But it was never enough to completely stymie the Soviet advances. And Army Group Center in particular had just suffered such enormous casualties and disruption that it was in a very weakened state by the time this fighting had settled down. Again, this is just a little bit further north, but one of the important elements to demonstrate here was the city of Smolensk. This had fallen early, I think it was July of 1941, to the Germans as they were advancing up this one major road, one paved road that was heading towards Moscow before they turned south to encompass the Soviet units near Kiev in a vast cauldron that netted more than 600,000 prisoners, okay, a number that is staggering in its understanding. That was only one pocket from 1941. But they had finally recovered this, and again, just driven the Germans back all along the front. It's an enormous, enormous amount of territory that's been retaken within a relatively short period of time. This gives you a better example from when they launched their counteroffensive starting July 17 and until December. And all of this territory has been retaken by the Soviets. And Crimea is cut off. And Kiev is here. Again, the destructiveness of this is enormous. if you watch any of the podcasts and videos that come from Ukraine in its current fighting, you'll see, armored vehicle here, there, blown up, destroyed. Here you have hundreds that are being wrecked. And if you've lost control of the battlefield, which is what happens when you're retreating, then just damaged vehicles, which otherwise might have been recovered and repaired, are no longer available to you. They're complete losses, the same way that if you have a prisoner of war, it's a complete loss to the other side. And in this particular case, while the Russians had a lot of damaged vehicles during these attacks, when they held the ground, those were recoverable, whereas the Germans were not. And that meant that rebuilding was, rebuilding. Holy mackerel, something bad happened there. Okay, well, anyway, that was near the end of the slides anyway. So let me just conclude with the following. By the end of 1943, with the failure of Operation Citadel and the success that occurred with the Russian counteroffensives that drove to this great degree, now the question is, what's next? The Allies in September 43 invade Italy proper. They've taken Sicily. Now they land at Salerno, and they're going to be on the continent, what Churchill called the soft underbelly, which turned out to be a lot tougher than anticipated. Russia, the Soviet Union is advancing, and there seems to be little that's going to stop them. The Allies are building up strength in England for a cross-channel invasion. Everybody knows that's coming. They're just not sure where exactly it'll happen or when it'll happen. But now you have a whole different set of issues that are of political importance and what's going to happen later in 44 and 45 and maybe 46 if the fighting continues until then. The depth of thinking, the competency of your military and political leaders is absolutely critical at this juncture to figure what the next steps are. We tend to think of it as being very obvious, and we know the outcome. But as I try to portray in these lectures, they didn't know what was going to happen the next day. They could only plan for it and anticipate. So in the what we'll call the Western theater, that is that area of primary concern for the British and Americans, what's the next step? Why Italy? What do we hope to accomplish there? What are the opportunities? What are the liabilities? Always recognizing that from the United States perspective, from General Marshall on down, that landing in France was the most important next step. And the British were resisting that to a great degree because they felt we were completely unprepared to do it. Similarly, in Stalin's view, he has been enormously successful. There still is a lot of territory, Soviet territory, that is still occupied by Germany, but Germany's back on its heels. And he can't help but have some high degree of optimism that he can destroy the German army. And then politically, what is that going to bring him? What is he looking to accomplish ultimately? If we shift to the Pacific theater, we have a similar set of issues. The Japanese had reached the extent of their perimeter, and now the southern perimeter had been severely dented. It hadn't been broken. But with the advance up the Solomons, the advance into New Britain, the taking of New Guinea, it's pretty clear to the Japanese that they are on the strategic defensive and will remain so until whenever the war ends. So what's your planning at that point? How are you going to prepare to resist further attacks? And then from the United States standpoint, where do we want to strike in order to collapse this perimeter further? The Central Pacific, which is under Nimitz, is largely bereft of any significant islands, not until you get pretty close to Japan. So our Navy is powerful. We're building aircraft carriers up the wazoo. What's the point of any major attack? And that's going to be a big contest between MacArthur and Nimitz. And that's going to have to be resolved at the highest levels of the military and political structure in our country. Not a done deal. Okay. So we keep those things in mind as we go forward. And the lesson for us is in front of us right now. Not that we're in charge, not that we're the ones making the decision, but I'll just throw these out as I did earlier this morning. How do you see the resolution of Ukraine right now? What do you think not might happen, not what you would wish to happen, what do you think is most likely to happen? What about Gaza? What's your feelings about that? How is that going to end? And because there's been some fighting on the West Bank and some in northern Israel against Hezbollah, and with Iran supporting all of them, and now has $16 billion of access that it didn't have 3 months ago. How are they going to use that money? What's their strategic goal? And if you're if you're really interested in controlling the South China Sea and Taiwan belongs to you, are you going to wait 5 years to take it? Or are you going to say, now's the time? And if you're Putin or if you're Zelensky, what do you do there? And that's not even to look at Africa or the Caucasus region and the role of Turkey and what's going on in Syria and so on. But these are all with us right now, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So the question is, what do we think, at least ourselves, because we're the ones who are going to be responsible for selecting our leaders. All right. Thank you again for your attention over weeks. And I have to tell you, it truly has been an honor to me to do this. And comments and criticisms are always welcome.
What's next?
Well, my understanding is for spring, not winter, we're going to continue this set of lectures into 1944. And I haven't clarified in my mind if it's possible to finish in the next set of lectures. It may not be. I mean, we all have such a deep appreciation for things that happened on D-Day and things of that sort. I think that spending time discussing that and reviewing all the different issues there is important, but then we've got the whole of the rest of the Pacific to deal with. And that again becomes lengthy, and what happens in the Eastern Front cannot be ignored either. So we'll see. If I survive and you're tolerant, we may continue. But okay, thanks. I appreciate it. Any questions, whatever, I'll stick around. Thank you.